This is Euronews Tonight. Here are your top stories. Russia attacks 5 railway stations in central and western Ukraine, causing casualties and making it harder for civilians to leave the country. On a visit to Kyiv, the US Secretaries of State and Defense say Washington wants to see Moscow militarily weakened and pledge more weapons support to Ukraine.
Here in the Cube, we look at misleading claims that Russian President Vladimir Putin did not attend an Easter church service.
And French President Emmanuel Macron takes a second term, but with the highest turnout on record from far-right voters. Can he unite a divided country? I'm Helena Humphrey. Good to have you with us. Russian forces have carried out airstrikes on at least 5 railway stations across central and western Ukraine. Officials say at least 5 people have been killed and many more injured. Kyiv says that Russia is deliberately targeting critical infrastructure. In the besieged port city of Mariupol, Ukraine says that efforts to establish humanitarian corridors to evacuate trapped civilians have failed. That is despite claims from Moscow that troops would cease hostilities in the Azovstal steelworks plant, where many people and resistance forces remain. Russia says Ukraine should show readiness to evacuate civilians by raising white flags, but Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk insisted the unilaterally announced corridor does not provide security. Meanwhile, the US says it wants to see Russia weakened following high-level talks in Kyiv. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday to discuss further aid for Ukraine. Austin says Ukraine can win with the right support and equipment. Washington has agreed to send another €300 million military aid package to Kyiv. Blinken says Russian forces in Ukraine are dramatically underperforming and that its economy is in shambles amid Western sanctions.
In terms of Russia's war aims, Russia has already failed and Ukraine has already succeeded because the principal aim that President Putin brought to this, in his own words, was to fully subsume Ukraine back into Russia, to take away its sovereignty and independence. And that has not happened and clearly will not happen.
Well, bringing us the very latest developments from Ukraine is our correspondent Sasha Vakulina, who joins me now. Sasha, good to see you. We heard from Antony Blinken as well as Lloyd Austin on that visit in Kyiv that, well, essentially they want to see Russia militarily weakened. How is this visit playing out in Kyiv? How's it being viewed?
This is a very strong comment, right, from an official coming this way. Blinken also said that the strategy of a massive support for Ukraine, massive pressure against Russia. This is what the US has been doing, and this is what he expects from all the NATO members. One day before that, on Saturday, giving the press conference, Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine is not the country for tragic and sad selfies. So the visits that are coming from politicians, from the allies, should bring the support as well. They should have something on the table. And this is what we saw from the US officials visiting Kyiv over the weekend. Since the beginning of this war, since the 24th of February, the US supplied more than $3.7 billion worth of arms to Kyiv. And with all these news and the lines that they will keep adding that and will keep adjusting that help and that support, the US has to make this statement about the continuous support that they are providing to Ukraine and that they will provide. Now, the other question, of course, will go to the other NATO members, specifically Germany. Germany has been criticized quite a lot recently about its not willingness or not readiness to provide arms and weapons to Ukraine. And we do know that Lloyd Austin will travel next to Germany, where some of these issues will be on the table to be discussed among the NATO ministers.
Definitely a strong quote there from President Zelensky saying Ukraine is not your country for sad selfies. Nevertheless, in places like Mariupol, for example, the situation does remain dire. Not everyone is out. We also know that Azovstal hasn't been fully evacuated. Russia saying that it's agreed to a ceasefire there. But Ukraine doesn't really see it that way, does it?
There was a completely unilateral statement from Russia today when Russian forces says that from 2 o'clock in the afternoon there will be a humanitarian corridor that would be open for Azovstal. Now, Kyiv responded saying that they were not advised on that. They did not discuss it. This is not the humanitarian corridor that was agreed upon. And the Deputy Prime Minister, Irina Vereshchuk, who is normally in charge of the humanitarian corridor, she said, look, she was ready to do so much as possible to secure that humanitarian corridor, but without the proper guarantees, the way it should be done, this cannot be considered as a humanitarian corridor. Therefore, she also asked she wanted Moscow to provide written security guarantees to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the humanitarian corridor has to be open with all the sides agreeing on that, and that was not the case today. Also, over Easter Sunday, Orthodox Easter Sunday, according to Mariupol authorities, around 150 people were taken from Mariupol to Russia.
Meanwhile, the situation in the east goes on, the onslaught there and the fighting, attacks on railway stations in central Ukraine and the west as well. Is this an escalation?
There is an escalation. This is also a sign that Russia is increasingly focusing on stations, on train stations and railway, because we've seen that started a few weeks ago with the attack in Kramatorsk, where people were evacuating and waiting for those trains, with 50 people died there in Kramatorsk. And now what's been happening here, of course, look, nowadays rails and trains, this is the safest way to evacuate for the civilians from all over Ukraine, and also this is the safest way to bringing supplies and the weapons to the other parts of Ukraine. And this is why we can see this more and more focus on targeting the train stations and the railways there. Fighting continues all over Ukraine. It has not stopped in the east, with heavy bombardment as well in Kharkiv, with Odessa strike over the weekend. This is southern Ukraine. This goes with the lines that we've heard from Russia last week, when they said the next stage of this war, they will be focusing also on securing the southern corridor, taking over eastern and southern part of Ukraine to get the access to Transnistria and Moldova.
All right, Sasha Vakalina, as ever, thanks so much for bringing us up to date. Sasha, thank you. Well, meanwhile, there are doubts online that Russian President Vladimir Putin attended an Easter church service over the weekend. Matthew, in our social media news desk, The Cube, has been taking a look at the claims.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, we've seen misinformation and false claims from both sides. And these claims now seem more and more to be targeting the leaders of the respective countries. There have been false rumours about Russian President Vladimir Putin and an Orthodox Easter church service held in Moscow over the weekend. The claims are that Putin did not attend this service, and instead pre-recorded footage of him was edited into the broadcast. You might have seen online claims that Putin was seen rehearsing for this church mass, and that in some shots he can't be seen attending the ceremony. These claims have been spread to cast doubt on Putin's health, or even suggest that he has fears over his security. However, if you take a look at agency independent news photos taken by the Associated Press, Reuters and Agence France-Presse, they all show that Putin did indeed attend this service. Here in The Cube, we've analysed the data to confirm these photos were indeed taken on the date of that mass. And in them, Putin can be seen wearing the same dark blue suit, a white shirt and a dark purple tie. And that's important because some people have suggested the photos were taken from last year's church service. But again, if you look at independent agency photos, you can see that Putin in 2021 was stood in the same position, but wearing a lighter red-coloured tie and also holding a different candle ornament. So there is clear evidence that Putin did indeed attend that church service in Moscow over the weekend. But Helena, as the war continues, we're likely to see more misleading claims like this, targeting not just Putin, but also President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and casting doubt on their health and their behaviour.
All right, Matthew and your team in The Cube, as ever, thanks so much. We can cross over now to our correspondent Galina Polinskaya in Paris for more analysis. Galina, good to see you. We've been hearing today from President Vladimir Putin. He's been speaking, addressing a meeting of the General Prosecutor's Office, where he accused the West of trying to divide Russia, and he also called on prosecutors to be more tough. What did he mean by that?
Good evening, Helena. While Vladimir Putin said that the West is staging a plot against Russia, that Western intelligence are trying to destroy Russia, to divide its public opinion and to put a shade to discredit its armed forces. And he stressed at this meeting with Russia's top prosecutors that the tool of the West in this, as he said, war, were the Western media and Western social media. He also spoke today, announced at this meeting that there was an attempt of assassination of a top Russian journalist, which failed because those who attempted were detained by the Federal Security Service of Russia. And later, the FSB released a videotape with one of the men, as they say, who took part in this attempt to assassinate a journalist. The face of this man was covered, but he was speaking about Vladimir Solovyov, the top pro-Kremlin journalist, and other pro-Kremlin journalists who were, according to him, in the list. And Vladimir Putin said that it was staged by Ukraine. Ukraine has already said that those accusations were absolutely false, but Vladimir Putin spoke about the terror which was brought to Russia, and what he asked, actually, at this meeting, is to be very quick in trying to hunt the fake news and those who are spreading fake news. And in Russia, everything which is not corresponding with the official point of view about Ukraine is considered fake news, according with the new law, and could be punished by very, very severe long prison sentences.
Well, meanwhile, Galina, we've also seen that US visit to Kyiv, the US and officials there saying that they want to minimize Russia's military. What do you think Moscow's response to that will be?
Well, Russia has already sent an official note to the United States, according to the US ambassador, to Russia's ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov. He spoke about this in an interview given to the state TV in Russia, and he said that Russia was determined to end this practice of the West and the US sending weapons to Ukraine. We have been hearing also warnings from various Russian top officials that NATO vehicles transporting weapons in Ukraine will be considered as legitimate targets for Russia. And Antonov today stressed that the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine were seen by Russia as he said, pouring oil on the flames and an attempt to undermine any chance of peace talks. So it is very hard to predict what would be Russia's next move, but one of the top Russia's officials today also said that Russia does not see any point in ceasefire right now.
All right, our correspondent there, Galina Polonskaya. Galina, as ever, thanks for your analysis. Emmanuel Macron says he will be a president for all of France as he prepares to begin another 5 years in office. His victory over Marine Le Pen was larger than expected, but more than 4 in 10 voters cast their ballot for the far right, their best ever result. Shona Murray reports now.
It's with the background music of Ode to Joy, the anthem of the European Union, that French President Emmanuel Macron marked his re-election. For the European Union, Macron's success against the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen is indeed a relief. His success rules out the prospect of great paralysis within the EU, particularly at such a crucial time during the war in Ukraine. However, it's this war and its far-reaching consequences which will dictate the political and policy agenda of the French presidency.
The priority is the urgency of the war in Ukraine and its economic consequences, the question of European defense, how to curb inflation, how to get out of oil and Russian gas, the question of sanctions also on Russia. And then there are certain projects to be carried out, in particular the question of the carbon mechanism at the borders for the climate transition.
But this decisive victory of Emmanuel Macron can't mask the distrust expressed by voters of Marine Le Pen towards the EU. With 41% of the vote, this showing for the extreme right marks the new fracture in the political world.
The great debate in France, after having been a right-left debate, is an opening-closing, optimist-pessimist, beneficiary of globalization or victim of globalization debate.
After France, authoritarian populists suffered other setbacks in Europe. The Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša lost the legislative elections to the Liberal candidate. This defeat further isolates Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has long pursued an illiberal programme against the EU.
The Slovenian result was actually just as interesting and important potentially as the French result, because here we had a Viktor Orban-like figure in Prime Minister Janez Janša defeated very comprehensively and somewhat unexpectedly, I would say. And it is at least the third big defeat for populist right-wing leaders in Europe over the last 6 months, including that of Boyko Borisov in Bulgaria and Mr. Babiš in the Czechia.
But the EU still has a problem on its hands if it wants to push back Eurosceptic populism and remind citizens of the long-term benefits of European unity. Shona Murray, Euronews, Brussels.
Well, on the day after the night before, we can go over to our international correspondent, Annelise Borges, who joins me from Paris. Annelise, this might be a second term for Macron, but at the same time, this is also the highest turnout for far-right voters. So how much of a challenge will he have now?
No, this is definitely going to pose a challenge for Emmanuel Macron over the next 5 years. First, because he will have to reunite a deeply fractured France. 13 million people voted for Marine Le Pen in the second round of these presidential elections. And that means something. That means, for example, that improving purchasing power, which was one of Marine Le Pen's main promises, will have to be an area of focus for Emmanuel Macron. He promised a new project for France, a project that is not a continuity of the last 5 years, but something new, something better, something that doesn't leave anyone behind. And we all know what happens when that is the case. We all remember the crisis called the Yellow Vests movement, something that really troubled the beginning of Emmanuel Macron's government. He will certainly try to avoid that kind of reaction at all costs. Helena?
And I think, Annelise, it's fair to say that one of the first challenges he will face, of course, is those parliamentary elections in June. What do you make of that? Is this the moment that the far left fights back?
Well, the leader of the far left has actually already started campaigning even before the night of the second round, even before the vote yesterday. Jean-Luc Mélenchon called on his voters to elect him as prime minister. He was talking about a third round of the election, citing the legislative vote in June, saying that it's through that they will make their voices heard. It's through that they will resist. Jean-Luc Mélenchon was considered by many here the real winner of this year's race. He gathered over almost 8 million votes in the first round. That is also a record for his movement. And Emmanuel Macron will have to try and find space for those demands as well going forward. We've seen how hard it's been for Emmanuel Macron to govern over the last 5 years. He did manage to apply some of his vision for France, but there was quite a lot of resistance, and also, of course, the global pandemic of COVID-19. But those difficulties that he has faced, he faced despite having control of both houses of Congress. Can you imagine if the situation changes in June? So Emmanuel Macron is said to have already started to mobilize a real army of supporters to continue this race, to continue fighting, and of course, with their aim is the elections in June.
That's the thing, Annelise. As you say, can you imagine? Can you imagine if he doesn't have that strong mandate? We all remember the Yellow Vest protests, for example, and he's still got those kind of issues in his in-tray. He's still got things like the pension reform and other kind of contentious issues. So how difficult would it be to then get on with the job when it comes to these kinds of reforms?
Well, Emmanuel Macron's team and his ministers and close allies and aides were speaking to the press last night, saying that he already has a clear mandate, that he won a resounding victory, that it was not the kind of success that we saw 5 years ago when he won 66% of the vote. Last night he got 58% of the vote, but it was a solid victory indeed, and that they hope they will be able to pass through some of those ambitious reforms that Emmanuel Macron has been talking about since 2017, notably the reform of of the pension system. But of course, this is going to be a challenge. Emmanuel Macron is a leader known to enjoy these formidable challenges. Will he be able to actually deliver a new France? A France, like he said yesterday, a green France? We'll have to wait and see. But of course, there will be resistance. Will it come in the shape of members of parliament that don't agree with his vision? Will it come in the streets? Well, that is what we're going to have to wait and see. And that's what Emmanuel Macron is going to have to pay to see as well.
Well, he's still got a few challenges ahead of him. International correspondent Annelise Borges in Paris reporting on it all. Annelise, thank you. Beijing residents are stocking up on food and other essentials amid a fear that the Chinese capital could be put into another lockdown as COVID cases surge. Authorities have imposed mass testing on 3 million people in the city's Chaoyang district. China is implementing a zero COVID policy to prevent the virus from spreading across the country. Twitter's board of directors are reportedly close to finalising a deal with Elon Musk over a bid by the billionaire to purchase the social media platform. The New York Times is reporting that the two sides are in negotiations over Musk's offer to buy Twitter in the early hours of Monday morning. The Tesla CEO already holds a 9.2% stake in the company. Now, many periods in its history, Berlin has been a magnet for creative professionals, and now the city is playing host to a new group of artists who've been uprooted from their homes in Ukraine by Russia's invasion. Tom Hill reports.
An old factory building in Berlin has been converted into a free workspace by the authorities for over 100 artists who have fled Ukraine.
I feel like I see in the streets of Berlin half of Kiev right now, so I feel like I may be living there.
Hannah, one of the artists who fled here, said that for a week after her arrival, she could do nothing but stare out of the window.
Feeling guilty every day because you're alive, you're here.
Her work is greatly influenced by events in her country.
They want to kill us. I don't know how it works. I don't know how it's possible, but it's true. And we see it and we feel it.
Those feelings, as well as a sense of uncertainty about how long they'll have to stay, are shared by tens of thousands of Ukrainians who've arrived in Berlin since the war began. Tom Hill, Euronews.
You're up to date. I'll see you soon.